We could have burned through a lot of ammo.
Good evening, folks. You're watching The Hungry Handgunner. I'm Nick. Thank you for joining me today. Today's discussion is going to have the unintended side effects of possibly ticking off some people and hopefully educating some others. So when we talk about gun control in the U.S., the narrative now is that it's just angry white people that own guns, things like that. But I think if we look at a historical history of gun control, especially within the United States, we'll see that its origins are much more insidious than just government control, which is also a huge part of it. But we also see a deeply rooted history of racism in gun control laws. Now, I am not a social justice warrior raging, telling people to check their privilege and things like that, but the fact remains that in the world there are racial disparities. In the U.S., there are still racial disparities. Contrary to what many people will tell you, that's really statistically evident. So when we go back in history and look at gun control measures that were passed, even going back before the Second Amendment was even ratified, we can see that a lot of the laws and legislation pertaining to gun control was not bothered with coded words or things like that. It was very explicit about blacks and other minorities being able to own weapons. As we progress further down the timeline, it's often run under the guise of safety. But if you look at how it disproportionately affects the populations of different races and things like that, it's still largely rooted in racism. Going all the way back to Virginia in 1640, there is a phrase that was passed. The statute actually said, prohibiting Negroes, slave and free, from carrying weapons, including clubs. So that's not even just gun control. That's going even further. Also from 1640, we had a race-based total gun ban, also from Virginia, that all such free mulattoes, Negroes, and Indians shall appear without arms. The statutes at large being a collection of all the laws of Virginia. Going to the year 1712, this one comes to us from South Carolina, it was a race-based total gun ban, an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes and slaves. And this was statutes at large of South Carolina. In 1791 in the United States, the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, and it read, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We all know that part. But however, 1792, we also had this. This was the Uniform Militia Act of 1792, called for the enrollment of every free, able-bodied white male citizen between the ages of 18 and 45 to be in the militia, and specified that every militia member was to provide himself with a musket or firelock, a bayonet, and ammunition. So again, every free, able-bodied white male citizen. 1806, coming to us from Louisiana, was a complete gun and self-defense ban for slaves. It was in the Black Code, Chapter 33, Section 19, Laws of Louisiana, provided that a slave was denied the use of firearms and all other offensive weapons. 1811, in Louisiana, was a complete gun ban for slaves. That was the Act of April 8, 1811, forbade sale or delivery of firearms to slaves. So we see a historical context. There's more of this. I'm going to drop a link to this in the description if you want to check it out for yourselves. It's very good about citing sources if you want to further extrapolate and go down and make sure it's all credible. Again, I have no interest in riling people up. I think this is an important part of history that is often just not discussed because it doesn't fit any modern day narratives that the powers that be would want us to be exposed to. So everybody knows that that's prior to enlightenment in the U.S. or whatever you want to call it. But even after that, it doesn't get much better. In 1902 in South Carolina, there was a first total civilian handgun ban. Now you're saying, well, that doesn't sound racist at all. The state banned all pistol sales except to sheriffs and their special deputies, which included chapters of the KKK and company strongmen. So, not hard to read between the lines on that one. In 1941 in Florida, a judge admitted that a gun law was passed to disarm black laborers. In concurring opinion narrowly construing a Florida gun control law passed in 1893, Justice Buford stated that the 1893 law was passed when there was a great influx of Negro laborers in the state. This same condition existed when the act was amended in 1901 and the act was passed for the purpose of disarming the Negro laborers. The statute was never intended to be applied to the white population and in practice has never been so applied. That's from Watson versus Stone, 148, Florida, 512, 524. So again, go to the description, check that out if you want. Some interesting things leading up to the Gun Control Act of 1968. You can reasonably infer that the Gun Control Act of 1968 backs all the way up to when schools first started being desegregated. There's a timeline of events here I want to read to you that I think will help put this in perspective. 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court held that racial segregation of schools violates the 14th Amendment. 1955, Alabama bus segregation ordinance held unconstitutional after boycott and NAACP protest. 1956, massive resistance to Supreme Court desegregation ruling called for 101 Southern congressmen. 1957, Congress approved first civil rights law for blacks. Governor ordered National Guard troops to prevent 9 blacks from entering all-white high school in Little Rock. President Eisenhower had to send federal military troops to enforce court order that the guardsmen be removed. 1960, sit-ins began February 1st when 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused to move from a lunch counter after being denied service. By 1961, more than 700,000 students, black and white, had participated in sit-ins. 1962, 3,000 troops were required to quell riots after University of Mississippi accepted their first black student. 1963, 200,000 people participated in the March on Washington at which Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November. 1964, the Omnibus Civil Rights Bill barring discrimination in voting, jobs, etc. 3 civil rights workers reported missing in Mississippi, found buried 2 months later. 21 white men arrested, 7 of whom an all-white jury convicted of conspiracy only. 1965, 34 dead in race riot in Watts area of Los Angeles. 1966, first black U.S. Senator in 85 years elected. That would have been Edward Brooke, Republican from Massachusetts. 1967, there were race riots in Newark, New Jersey. It killed 26, injured 1,500 with over 1,000 arrested. Race riots in Detroit killed at least 40, injured 2,000, and left 5,000 homeless. Was quelled by 4,700 federal paratroopers and 8,000 National Guardsmen. Thurgood Marshall was sworn in October 2nd as first black justice to the U.S. Supreme Court. 1968, Martin Luther King assassinated in April. Robert F. Kennedy assassinated in June. So then we get to the Gun Control Act of 1968. You can see the racial tension going on, right? When the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed, avowed anti-gun journalist Robert Sherrill frankly admitted that the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed not to control guns, but to control blacks. He went on to say that inasmuch as a majority of Congress did not want to do the former, but were ashamed to show that their goal was the latter, the result was that they did neither. Indeed, this law, the first gun control law passed by Congress in 30 years, was one of the grand jokes of our time. First of all, bear in mind that it was not passed in one piece, but as a combination of 2 laws. The original 1968 Act was passed to control handguns after the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated with a rifle. Then it was repealed and repassed to include the control of rifles and shotguns after the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy with a handgun. The moralists of our federal legislature, as well as the sentimental editorial writers, insist that the Act of 1968 was a kind of memorial to King and Kennedy. If so, it was certainly a weird memorial, as it can be seen not merely for the handgun, long gun, shell game, but from the inapplicability of the law to their deaths. 1988 in Illinois. Poor citizens were singled out for a gun ban in Illinois. Starting in late 88, the Chicago Housing Authority and the Chicago Police Department enacted and enforced an official policy, Operation Clean Sweep, which applied to all housing units owned and operated by the CHA. The purpose was the confiscation of firearms, illegal narcotics, and consisted of severely limiting the right of CHA tenants to associate in the residence with family members and other guests. Tenants had to sign in and out of the building, producing to the police or CHA officials photo ID. Relatives, including children and grandchildren, were not allowed to stay over, even on holidays. CHA tenants who objected or attempted to interfere with these warrantless searches were arrested. The ACLU filed a lawsuit seeking declaratory and injunctive relief on behalf of the CHA tenants against the enforcement of Operation Clean Sweep. The complaint was filed in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, Eastern Division. A consent decree was entered in November 30th, 1989, in which the CHA and CPD agreed to abide by certain standards and in which the scope and purposes of such emergency housing inspections were limited. It goes on to state that the demographics of those housing projects were approximately 90% African American. In 1990, again, from Virginia, where all this kind of started, poor citizens were singled out for a gun ban in Virginia. The District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia upheld a ban imposed by the Richmond Housing Authority on the possession of all firearms, whether operable or not, in public housing projects. The Richmond Tenants Organization had challenged the ban, arguing that such requirements had made the city's 14,000 public housing residents second-class citizens. In 1994, the president sought to single out all poor citizens residing in federal housing for a gun ban. The Clinton administration introduced H.R. 3838 in 1994 to ban guns in federal public housing, but the House Banking Committee rejected it. Similar legislation was filed in 94 in the Oregon and Washington state legislatures. So, when we look at things like the demographics for low-income families and things like that, and we're not going to get into a complete socio-economical breakdown here, but when we look at these laws and frequently what they're tied into, what other current events precipitated them, I think it's pretty easy to see that a lot of these came about because there was worry that minority populations were arming themselves. And historically in other countries you can see that as well, going back to slave-owning times. You wanted to maintain that power dynamic. You couldn't have it shifting on you. So frequently, the populace that was feared gaining power was barred from owning arms and ammunition. So I just want to point that out. Does it have any merit in today's debate? Well, you be the judge. I think that if you look at crime rates and the demographics in those areas with higher crime rates, you will find that gun control would disproportionately affect minorities. That being said, I think that we have kind of seen a power play by the government in the recent years to kind of quell any verbal, spoken, written insurrection, and they haven't really had to quell much physical insurrection, but I think it would be safe to say that a gun ban would definitely be taking proactive steps to limiting the scope of what insurrection could ever occur. So, with that being said, I'm not saying now's the time to grab your guns and go march on political hotspots or things like that, or your senators or anything like that. I'm not inflaming those sorts of actions, but I think it's important to keep a clear mindset of what often precipitates a gun ban, what often follows gun bans, or when arms are barred. And you can go to other countries historically and look at things like that. Communist regimes frequently would disarm populations before their draconian policies took full effect. Nazi Germany is well documented for things like that as well. So I think that it's always a good idea to remain students of history, to apply the lessons of the past to our present and future as well, because if we do not learn and value and pay attention to history, we are doomed to repeat it. And that's not something I want for me or you or my children or your children. We should be moving forward as a country. We should be regaining some of the freedoms we have lost. It seems like every passing year there's another restriction. And eventually that net's going to get tighter and tighter, and there's not going to be a way to fight our way out of it. So do some reflecting on that. Think about how many things require a permit and government licensing, fees paid to the government to do. I would also argue that if you have to pay the government to exercise a right, well, that's no longer a right. That is a privilege sold back to you, which again places a cost barrier, regardless of dollar amount, to exercising rights, to the free exercise thereof. So carry permits, things like that. Here in the state of Georgia, it's about $80. That's not a lot of money to me. It's not insignificant, but it's not a deal breaker. But there was a time in my life where it would have been. And chances are there may be other people in that situation that are barred the carrying of arms legally because of cost. So at what point does that become an infringement on a right? I don't know, you decide. But for me, that is an infringement. So I think I've said enough today to sufficiently anger many of you. I hope not. I really hope not. But I think it's important to keep an objective look on things and realize that admitting that there may be a problem isn't necessarily a reflection of our own guilt in that problem, but looking at things objectively and figuring out maybe we do have it better than somebody that may not share our same complexion is an important part of the human experience, because historically we have not always had equal footing, and even now I think in a lot of areas we still don't. So again, this isn't some bleeding heart social justice warrior video. This is just kind of my own introspection at 31 with confronting some previously held beliefs and things like that, and where I've arrived at it today. So guys, feel free to share your comments below. Please keep it respectful. You guys normally do a great job at that, so I don't really want to have to moderate this super heavy. I think there's room for differing opinions. Just be respectful to each other. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.